A wild horse stood in the middle of the road, and instead of running, it waited for the man who had spent his life driving them away. That morning was supposed to be ordinary. The rancher drove the same road he had driven for decades, believing the land obeyed fences, maps, and men like him. Then a wild horse stepped into his path and didn't move. It didn't threaten him. It didn't run. It simply stood there as if asking him to follow. What waited beyond that road would force him to face a choice that would change how he saw the land, the animals, and himself forever. The truck moved steadily across the dry plain, its tires humming over a road the rancher had driven so many times he no longer thought about where it led. Morning light spread thin and pale across the land, revealing cracked earth, brittle grass, and fence lines that ran straight as stubborn thoughts toward the horizon. To him, this road was not just a way through the prairie, it was proof of order. He had built his life on roads like this, predictable, measured, controlled. Inside the cab, the air smelled faintly of dust and old leather. His hands rested easily on the steering wheel, thick fingers marked by years of rope burn and sun. He did not rush. There was no need. The land waited for him, as it always had. Cattle needed checking. A section of fence near the ravine might need reinforcing. Routine work, honest work, the kind that kept a man upright when the world tried to bend him. He told himself he liked the silence out here, but it was more than liking. It was necessity. Silence did not ask questions. Silence did not remind him of the day the mountains took something from him and never gave it back. Out here, with only wind and distance, memories stayed manageable, pressed down beneath the weight of habit. The truck crested a low rise, and the road stretched ahead, empty and familiar. He adjusted his grip, eyes forward, already planning the next hour. That was when something dark cut across the pale ribbon of dirt. He hit the brakes. Dust exploded upward, a thick, choking cloud that swallowed the windshield. The truck skidded, then stopped with a jolt that rattled the mirrors. For a brief second, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. As the dust settled, a shape emerged. A horse stood in the middle of the road, not grazing, not startled, just standing there, square, still, impossibly calm. Its coat was dark, dulled by dirt and sun, its mane tangled by wind. It was lean in the way wild animals are lean, all sinew and restraint. The rancher stared, irritation rising first, as it always did. Wild horses were trouble. They broke fences, spooked cattle, drank water meant for livestock. He had chased enough of them off his land to know better than to hesitate. He pressed the horn. The sound tore through the quiet, sharp and angry. The horse did not move. He leaned forward, squinting through the glass. Most horses would bolt at the first blast of noise, panic driving them off the road and into the open. This one didn't even flinch. It stood with its head high, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the truck, but on him. A strange, crawling sensation moved up his spine. He pressed the horn again, longer this time, frustration tightening his jaw. Still nothing. The horse remained where it was, hooves planted as if the road itself belonged to it. "Get out of the way," he muttered, though there was no one to hear him. His foot hovered over the gas pedal. He could ease forward, crowd the animal off the road. He had done it before. Yet something held him back. The distance between them was only a few yards, but it felt wider than the plain itself. The horse's eyes were dark and steady, not wild with fear, not dull with submission. They were alert, aware. For reasons he could not name, his hand began to tremble. He noticed it with irritation, curling his fingers into a fist to steady them. He had faced storms, injuries, broken equipment miles from help. He had buried people he loved and kept going because stopping wasn't an option. A horse standing in the road had no right to make his pulse race like this. The animal shifted then, not away, but slightly to the side, taking a few deliberate steps forward before stopping again. It turned its head just enough to look back at him over its shoulder, waiting. The rancher swallowed. The road, his road, no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like a line he had been stopped at, drawn not by fences or law, but by a living thing that refused to yield. He realized with a flicker of unease that the horse was not blocking him by accident. It was asking him to choose. He opened the truck door, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped down onto the dirt. Heat rose from the ground, pressing against his boots. The horse did not run. It did not challenge him. It simply stood, patient, as if certain he would follow. "All right," he said quietly, unsure who he was speaking to, himself or the land or the animal that had claimed his attention without force. The horse turned and began to walk away from the road, slow and purposeful, heading toward the rough country beyond the fence line. Behind him, the rancher hesitated, eyes flicking back to the truck, to the road that led to all the things he understood. Then he took a step forward and followed. He moved after the horse with a caution that annoyed him. The animal's hooves left soft, broken marks in the dirt shoulder, then angled away from the road as if the road had only been a place to catch his attention, nothing more. The rancher watched the distance open between them and felt a sting of pride at the idea of being led anywhere by something he'd spent most of his life driving off. The horse crossed a shallow ditch and slipped through a gap where the sage grew thick, unbothered by the barbed wire fence running parallel to the road a few yards away. It knew the land in a way the rancher didn't like to admit. It moved as if it could feel where the ground was firm beneath the dust, as if it had memorized every hidden rock, every washout, every place a man in a hurry could ruin himself. He stopped, glanced back at his truck, and made a choice that felt small but carried weight. If he kept walking, he'd lose the animal in the brush. If he drove after it, he'd be doing something he almost never did, using his truck for anything other than work with a purpose he could name. He climbed back into the cab, shut the door, and let the engine idle for a moment, listening to the steady churn and the faint rattle of something loose in the dash. He eased forward, not on the road now, but along the shoulder, tires crunching over gravel and dried clumps of grass. The horse stayed ahead, not fleeing, not racing, simply keeping a measured distance, as if it had decided exactly how close he was allowed to be. He tried to treat it like any other wild horse, an intrusion, a problem to solve. He told himself it had learned the road was a safe place from predators, that it was stubborn or sick or stupid. But every time he leaned forward to study its posture, he saw the same thing: awareness. The horse's ears flicked at sounds he couldn't catch. Its head lifted when the wind shifted. It adjusted its path as if it were reading the terrain like words on a page. The rancher reached down and turned on the radio, more out of habit than desire. A burst of static filled the cab, then a distant country station cut in and out, like a voice trying to speak through a closed door. He shut it off again. The noise felt wrong out here, like a lie. The horse led him toward an old cattle guard where the road dipped and a dry creek bed crossed underneath. The rancher had welded that guard himself 10 years ago after a flood took out the last one. He knew every bolt, every bar. Yet now, approaching it, he realized he'd never noticed the way the creek carved the banks on either side, the way the sand held faint tracks, rabbit, coyote, something heavier that had passed during the night. The horse stepped over the cattle guard with ease, hooves landing on the far side without hesitation, then turned off again into open ground. The rancher had to drive around the guard, bumping his truck through a gap where the fence line sagged. He winced at the sound of wire scraping lightly against metal. That was his fence, his responsibility. A man didn't just push through his own boundary because a wild animal suggested it. Still, his hands kept moving, and the truck kept following. The land changed as he left the road behind. The flat prairie gave way to scattered stone and low ridges where scrub clung to life. The wind found new angles to cut through, carrying the dry, metallic scent of sun-baked rock. Somewhere out in the distance, a hawk circled in slow, unhurried loops, as if it had all the time in the world. The horse glanced back once, not long enough to be cautious, not quick enough to be meaningless. Just a check, like a foreman making sure the crew was still behind him. The rancher's throat tightened. He didn't like that his mind reached for human comparisons. He didn't like that it fit. He drove slower. The truck's suspension complained as the ground grew uneven. Each bump traveled up through the seat into his spine, He kept one hand on the wheel and one near the gear shift, ready to correct, ready to stop, ready to turn around at the first sign of trouble, yet he didn't stop. The horse's pace stayed steady, threading him between clusters of rocks, like it knew the limits of his vehicle better than he did. A sudden movement in the brush made him flinch. A jackrabbit shot out, ears laid back, and vanished into the sage. The horse didn't react. It stayed on course. The rancher realized his own body had tensed like a man expecting an ambush. That startled him more than the rabbit. "You're not scared of anything, are you?" he said under his breath. The words sounded foolish in the cab, but they wouldn't leave his head. He passed a weathered wooden post half buried in sand. An old marker from before the county redrew property lines. He remembered his father pointing to one like it when he was a kid, explaining where their land ended and someone else's began. The rancher used to believe those posts were permanent truths. Now, following a wild horse that did not acknowledge them, he felt how fragile those truths really were. The horse angled toward a low ridge that rose like a scar across the earth. The rancher knew what lay beyond it: rough country, bad footing, gullies that could swallow a man's ankle or a truck's front tire without warning. His jaw tightened. He could turn back now and blame it on common sense. He could tell himself the animal would eventually wander off, and he'd done enough. Instead, he crested the ridge behind it. On the other side, the land fell away into a wide basin of broken ground, dry washes, scattered boulders, sun-bleached shrubs. The truck's tires spun slightly in loose sand before gripping again. The rancher swore under his breath, adjusting the wheel, feeling the first flicker of unease that had nothing to do with the horse and everything to do with the fact that he was now somewhere he didn't drive unless he had to. He kept going anyway. The horse descended with a quiet confidence, hooves finding purchase where his tires struggled. It wove down into the basin, then paused near a patch of shade cast by a leaning rock formation. The rancher stopped the truck a safe distance back, engine still running, heat rolling off the hood in shimmering waves. He stepped out and felt the sun hit him like a physical force. The air was thinner here, drier, carrying grit that found its way into his teeth. He walked a few steps forward, boots sinking slightly into sand, and studied the ground. There were tracks, more than before. A scuff where something had slid. A deeper print, fresh enough that the edges hadn't collapsed. The rancher crouched, touched the sand with 2 fingers, and felt a faint coolness below the surface that didn't match the heat above. His eyes traveled along the basin until they caught on something else. A dark stain on a stone, as if water had been there not long ago. Water didn't last this time of year, not out here. The horse stood in the shade, breathing slow, head lifted, ears forward. It wasn't resting. It was listening. The rancher straightened, scanning the basin, feeling the hair on his arms rise as the wind shifted again. It carried something new, not a smell he recognized immediately, but a difference that made his instincts hum. The kind of difference that meant something had happened here recently. He took another step, then another, moving away from the truck without meaning to, drawn by the horse's stillness more than its movement. The animal's body was a question mark against the pale rock, and the rancher found himself answering by simply being there. The horse stepped out of the shade and walked farther into the basin, deliberate as ever, then slowed and looked back, not waiting now, but insisting, its gaze pinned on him with a quiet urgency he couldn't pretend not to understand. The rancher followed without speaking, his boots finding their own rhythm in the loose ground as the basin opened wider around him. He kept his eyes moving, reading the land the way he always had, by slope, by shadow, by the way stones gathered where water once ran. Yet something had shifted. He was no longer scanning for problems to fix. He was listening for something he couldn't name. The horse slowed as the ground grew uneven, stepping with care along the edge of a shallow wash that cut a pale scar through the basin. Its movements were economical, every placement of hoof considered, as if waste itself were dangerous out here. The rancher noticed how it never stepped into the center of the wash, where sand looked firm but hid pockets of collapse. He adjusted his path to match, surprised to find himself trusting the animal's judgment without consciously deciding to. A gust of wind pushed through the basin, low and steady, carrying dust that stung his eyes. He turned his face away, blinking, and in that brief moment of blindness he felt exposed. Too far from the truck, too deep into ground he didn't usually enter alone. When his vision cleared, the horse had stopped. It stood near a cluster of rocks, darkened by old moisture, its body angled slightly toward him, head lifted. The space between them felt deliberate now, measured to the foot. He took another step and halted when the horse shifted its weight. Not back, not forward, just enough to signal that this was close enough. They regarded each other in silence. Up close, the horse looked older than he'd first thought. Not aged by weakness, but by endurance. Small scars marked its legs, pale lines against dark hair. Its ribs showed faintly when it breathed, expanding and settling with calm precision. The eyes, though, those were what caught him. They were not wide with panic, nor dulled by exhaustion. They were steady, dark pools that reflected the light without giving anything away. He had spent a lifetime believing he could read animals. Cattle telegraphed fear with every muscle. Horses, domesticated ones at least, learned to look to humans for cues. This horse did neither. It held his gaze without challenge, without submission, and without apology. The rancher felt the oddest sensation then, not of being watched, but of being weighed. He shifted his stance, the leather of his boots creaking softly. "All right," he murmured again, the word falling uselessly into the open air. He wasn't asking it to move. He wasn't commanding it to do anything. The sound was a reflex, a way to fill the quiet that pressed against his chest. The horse did not respond. It simply continued to look at him. Memories rose uninvited, of another gaze held too long, of warning signs dismissed because he'd been certain of his own judgment. He saw himself younger, stronger, standing at the edge of a steep cut in the mountains, while someone behind him hesitated. He'd waved them on, confident the path would hold. It hadn't. The sound of stone breaking loose had been sharp and final, and the silence afterward had never truly left him. His jaw tightened, and he forced the memory down. This was different. This was just a horse. Except it wasn't. The wind shifted again, and with it came a faint sound, so soft he almost missed it. Not the cry of a bird, not the scrape of stone. Something weaker, interrupted, like breath catching where it shouldn't. The rancher's head snapped toward the far side of the basin. The sound faded as quickly as it came, swallowed by distance and wind. He waited, holding still, counting his own breaths. The horse's ears flicked forward, then to the side. It turned its head slightly, aligning its body with the direction of the sound. That was all the confirmation he needed that he hadn't imagined it. "You hear it too," he said, the words leaving him before he thought better of it. The horse finally moved, stepping away from the rocks and heading deeper into the basin. Its pace was unchanged, but something about it felt sharpened, focused. The rancher followed, heart beating a little faster now, every sense alert. They passed between two boulders where the ground dipped unexpectedly. His foot slid, and he caught himself with a sharp intake of breath, cursing under his breath as adrenaline flared. The horse paused a few yards ahead and glanced back, waiting, not patiently this time, but watchfully. "I'm fine," he muttered, more to himself than to it. He straightened and continued, aware now of how easily a misstep out here could turn serious. The basin funneled them toward a narrow stretch where the walls rose on either side, rock faces bleached and fractured by sun and time. Shadows pooled in the crevices, cool and deceptive. The smell reached him before the sight did. It was faint but unmistakable, a damp, earthy note that didn't belong in a place this dry. His stride slowed, and he scanned the ground more carefully, spotting darker patches of sand, compressed as if something heavy had pressed down and struggled to move again. The horse stopped at the mouth of the narrow stretch and turned fully toward him. This time, the look it gave him was different. There was urgency in it now, subtle but undeniable. Not fear, never fear, but insistence. The kind that didn't ask whether he was willing, only whether he was capable. The rancher felt his pulse quicken. He took a step forward, then another, and the horse held its ground. For a moment they stood close enough that he could see the rise and fall of its chest, the faint tremor in its flank as it inhaled. He resisted the impulse to reach out. This was not an animal that accepted touch. This was an animal that demanded respect. "I don't know what you think I can do," he said quietly. The horse did not move. It did not blink. The wind carried the sound again, clearer this time. A thin, broken cry that tightened something deep in his chest. He felt it there, a pull that had nothing to do with logic or ownership or boundaries drawn on old maps. The horse turned away at last, stepping into the narrow stretch without hesitation, trusting him to follow. The rancher exhaled slowly, aware that the choice had already been made. He stepped forward into shadow and stone, leaving the open basin behind. The passage narrowed until the walls seemed to lean inward, pressing heat and shadow together. The rancher felt the temperature drop as he stepped fully between the rock faces. The air cooler here, but heavier, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly organic beneath it. His boots scraped against gravel that hadn't seen a tire track in years, maybe decades. This was not land he worked. This was land he avoided. Ahead of him, the horse moved with the same deliberate confidence, its hooves striking stone with soft, hollow sounds that echoed briefly before disappearing. It did not slow to make sure he followed. It did not hurry to escape him. It simply went on, as if the path itself belonged to its memory. The rancher adjusted his hat and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His breathing felt louder than it should have, each inhale scraping slightly in his chest. He told himself it was just the narrow space playing tricks on him, the way confined places always did. He'd never liked them. Too many places to stumble, too few ways out. The rock walls opened just enough for the light to spill in uneven ribbons. In those slanted beams he saw more signs now, scratches along the stone at knee height, disturbed gravel where something had slipped and regained its footing. He knelt briefly, running his fingers along one of the marks. It was fresh. Too fresh to ignore. "This is bad ground," he said quietly, the words instinctive, like a warning he'd once given another man. The horse flicked an ear, but didn't turn around. They moved deeper, and the land sloped downward in a way that pulled at his balance. He leaned forward slightly, careful with each step, aware of how far he now was from the truck. If something happened here, an injury, a fall, help would not come quickly. The thought stirred irritation, then something closer to fear. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't packed for it. He had followed. The sound came again. Clearer this time, closer. It was not loud. It didn't carry the panic of a scream. It was thin, broken, uneven, like something trying to call without enough strength left to do it properly. The rancher stopped walking, every muscle in his body tightening as he pinpointed the direction. To the left, where the rock face dipped into a shallow depression filled with darker earth. The horse slowed, but did not stop. Its head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as it drew in scent. The rancher watched its shoulders tense, watched the subtle shift in its stride, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade. He took another step and nearly lost his footing as the ground changed abruptly beneath him. The dirt here was softer, packed unevenly, as if water had once pooled and then vanished without warning. He caught himself against the rock wall, palm scraping stone, heart pounding. "Damn it," he muttered, standing still until the rush of dizziness passed. The horse halted then, finally turning back toward him. For a moment it simply stood, body angled protectively toward the depression ahead, eyes fixed on his face. There was no accusation in its gaze, no impatience. Only a steady awareness of his presence, his limits. He straightened, embarrassed by his own stumble. He had prided himself on knowing terrain, on reading land like a second language. Yet here he was, misjudging ground that the horse had navigated without pause. "All right," he said under his breath, slower now. "I get it." The horse turned away again and stepped carefully down the slope, testing each placement before committing its weight. The rancher mirrored the movement, angling his body, letting gravity work with him instead of against him. His senses sharpened as he moved, eyes scanning, ears tuned, nose catching the dampness more clearly now. At the bottom of the depression, the earth darkened further. A narrow trickle of moisture clung to the base of the rocks, barely more than a stain, but enough to feed a thin line of green growth struggling against the brown. He crouched and pressed his fingers into the soil. It was cool, recently disturbed. The sound came again, unmistakable now. It was closer than he'd thought. The rancher stood slowly, pulse thudding in his ears. He followed the line of darker earth toward a break in the rocks where the ground dropped sharply out of sight. He approached with caution, each step measured, every instinct screaming that this was a place where mistakes were punished. The horse stopped at the edge. The rancher came up beside it and looked down. For a moment, his mind refused to make sense of what he saw. The space below was a narrow cut in the earth, steep-sided and uneven, where runoff had carved a sudden channel after some forgotten storm. At the bottom, shadows tangled with light, concealing and revealing in the same breath. Then he saw the movement. Small, uncoordinated, desperate. A foal lay wedged awkwardly against the slanted wall of the cut, its legs scrambling uselessly against loose dirt that collapsed each time it tried to push upward. Its coat was lighter than the horse beside him, still carrying the softness of youth. But it was caked with mud and dust. Its sides heaved with effort, each breath shallow and fast. The sound he'd been hearing tore free of its throat again, weak and strained. The rancher felt something seize in his chest, sharp and unexpected. He swallowed hard, eyes locked on the struggling animal below. The drop wasn't deep enough to kill it outright, but it was deep enough to trap it. Every failed attempt to climb only loosened more earth, dragging it farther down. He glanced at the horse beside him, understanding landing with a quiet, awful certainty. This wasn't about blocking a road. This wasn't about territory or defiance. The horse hadn't led him here to be chased away. It had led him here because it couldn't do this alone. The rancher exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The land around them was silent now, as if holding its breath. He looked from the foal to the slope, then back to the horse whose presence had changed the course of his day, and perhaps more than that. "Well," he said quietly, voice rough, "you didn't bring me all this way for nothing." The rancher crouched at the edge of the cut, careful not to send loose dirt sliding down toward the struggling foal. From this angle, the depth of the channel was clearer, deeper than it had looked at first glance. The walls slanted just enough to invite false hope and then betray it. The foal kicked again, hooves scrabbling, its small body trembling with exhaustion. Each movement dislodged more soil, and the rancher winced as it slipped a few inches lower. "Easy," he said instinctively, though the animal could not understand him. Behind him, the horse shifted its weight, hooves grinding softly against stone. He did not need to look to know it was watching every motion, every hesitation. He felt that gaze on his back like a hand pressing him forward and holding him still at the same time. He scanned the ground around him, mind switching into a familiar mode. Assessment, calculation, risk. He could climb down, maybe. The slope was steep and the dirt unstable, but he'd handled worse. The problem wasn't getting to the foal. It was getting it out. Lifting a panicked animal, even a young one, was a good way to break bones, his or its. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. Another ravine, another misjudged slope. He'd been younger then, convinced his footing was sure. Someone had followed him without question, trusting his confidence. When the ground gave way, it had happened fast, stone turning to gravel, balance lost in an instant. He still remembered the sound of a body hitting rock below, remembered shouting into a space that did not answer back. His hands curled into fists. He forced his breathing to slow. "I'm not making that mistake again," he murmured. The horse stepped closer, stopping just behind him. He could feel its presence now, solid and warm, a quiet counterweight to the memory pressing in on him. He glanced back and met its eyes, finding no blame there, only urgency, steady and unrelenting. The foal cried out again, weaker this time, and the sound cut through his hesitation like a command. "All right," he said, louder now, as if committing himself. "All right." He stood and moved back up the slope, retracing his steps toward the narrow passage they'd come through. His boots found firmer ground near the rock wall, and he followed it until the cut widened just enough to allow him to descend without sliding. He tested each foothold before trusting it, angling his body, keeping his weight low. The dirt shifted beneath him, but held. At the bottom, the air felt cooler, trapped between walls that blocked the sun. The foal's eyes rolled toward him as he approached, white showing in flashes as it struggled. Its breathing was ragged now, chest fluttering too fast for its size. "Easy," he said again, softer this time. He held his hands out where it could see them, palms open, movements slow. He had worked with frightened animals before, but never like this. There was no halter, no rope, no familiar human touch to calm it. Only his voice and his patience. The foal kicked weakly, then stilled, sides heaving. Its legs trembled, coated in mud that clung like glue. He reached out and brushed his fingers along its neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath thin skin. The animal flinched, but did not bolt. It couldn't. That helplessness tightened something in his chest. Above them, the horse stood at the edge of the cut, head lowered, ears forward. It did not whinny. It did not pace. It simply watched. The rancher assessed the slope again from below. He could try to guide the foal up step by step, but one slip could send them both tumbling. He could leave, fetch rope from the truck, but that would take time, and the foal was already fading. Its movements had slowed, each breath more labored than the last. He swallowed, weighing the options, feeling the old fear coil tighter as he realized what this would cost him. If he stayed and tried to lift, he risked falling. If he left to get help, the foal might not last. The land did not care about good intentions. It only responded to action. The memory of that other fall pressed in again, heavier now, and for a brief, shameful moment he considered climbing out alone and leaving nature to settle its own accounts. Wild animals died out here all the time. That was the way of it. No one would ever know. But he would. The horse shifted above him, hooves scraping stone, and the sound snapped something into place. He looked up and met its gaze again, and in that moment he understood what truly terrified him, not the risk of falling, not the pain, not even the possibility of dying. It was the thought of turning away. "All right," he said one last time, voice rough but resolved. "We'll do it together." He positioned himself behind the foal, bracing his boots against the slanted wall, testing his footing until he found a stance that might hold. He wrapped his arms around the small body, feeling how light it was, how fragile. The foal struggled weakly, then sagged against him, too tired to fight. "On 3, he said absurdly, as if counting could make the ground more solid. He lifted. The dirt shifted immediately, sliding beneath his boots, and his heart lurched as his balance wavered. He adjusted, muscles screaming as he compensated, leaning into the slope instead of away from it. The foal's hooves scraped uselessly, then found nothing. Above them, the horse moved closer to the edge, its body blocking the wind, casting a sliver of shade that cooled the air just enough to matter. The rancher didn't question it. He focused on the weight in his arms, on each inch gained. The old fear surged, sharp, paralyzing. But this time he did not let it decide for him. He pushed through it, breath burning in his chest, legs shaking as he climbed. The ground held. When he reached the top, he collapsed to one knee, pulling the foal with him onto solid earth. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, hands still locked around the small, trembling body, as if letting go might undo everything. The foal coughed, then drew a deeper breath. The rancher closed his eyes, head bowing as something inside him finally loosened. He did not release the foal right away. The animal lay against his chest, its small body shuddering as breath slowly found a steadier rhythm. Heat radiated through his arms, a fragile warmth that felt too easily lost. He stayed kneeling, one knee pressed into the dirt, the other planted for balance, as if the ground might still betray him if he relaxed too soon. When he finally eased his grip, The foal sagged onto its side, legs folding awkwardly beneath it. Its chest rose and fell in uneven but living pulses. Mud streaked its flank, and one ear twitched weakly, responding to the wind that slid down into the cut and curled around them. The rancher wiped his face with a shaking hand and forced himself to stand. His legs trembled, not from weakness alone, but from the release of something he had been holding tight for years. He felt hollowed out and heavy at the same time, as if the effort had scraped him raw. Above them, the horse stepped closer, lowering its head until its muzzle hovered inches from the foal. It did not touch. It only breathed, slow and deep, the sound grounding and low. The foal stirred at that, stretching its neck, letting out a faint, breathy sound that was not quite a cry anymore. "There you go," the rancher murmured, surprised by the softness in his voice. The wind shifted again, threading through the rocks with a different tone now, less sharp, less urgent. He noticed it without trying, the way one notices a room after a door has been opened. The crisis had loosened its grip, but the situation was far from settled. The foal tried to push itself upright and failed, legs buckling beneath it. The rancher moved quickly, bracing it with one arm, steadying its chest until it found enough balance to remain upright for a few seconds. He could feel how weak it still was, how much energy the struggle had drained. He glanced around the narrow basin, assessing again, but with a new understanding. Getting the foal out of the cut had been only the first problem. Now there was the matter of keeping it alive long enough for it to recover, and the even larger question of what came next. He straightened slowly, hands on his hips, and looked at the horse. For the first time since they had met, the animal did not look like a force holding him in place. It looked tired. Its sides expanded and contracted with measured effort, nostrils flaring slightly as it drew in the thin air. Dust clung to its legs, and a faint sheen of sweat darkened its neck. "You've been standing out here a while," he said quietly. The horse lifted its head, ears flicking toward him, then back to the foal. It did not move away. It did not press closer. It simply stayed. The rancher felt the weight of time settle on his shoulders. Out here, time was never neutral. Every minute carried consequence. The foal needed water, shade, time to rest. None of those things were plentiful in this basin. He scanned the rocks again and spotted the thin ribbon of moisture seeping from a fracture in the stone farther down the cut. It was barely more than a damp stain, but it was something. He knelt, cupped his hands beneath it, and waited as drops gathered slowly, painfully slow, until he had enough to wet his palms. He brought his hands to the foal's mouth and let the water trickle in. The foal swallowed weakly, then coughed, but the movement was encouraging. Life, stubborn and unyielding, was still at work. Behind him the horse shifted, hooves scraping softly. The rancher turned just in time to see it lift its head sharply, ears pinning forward. He followed its gaze instinctively, eyes narrowing as he listened. At first there was nothing. Then he heard it, a distant rumble, low and hollow, like stone grinding against stone. He froze, breath caught halfway in his chest. The sound faded, then came again, closer this time, traveling through the rock beneath his feet. A landslide. Not a full collapse, not yet, but the warning signs were unmistakable. This cut was unstable. The storm that had carved it had left behind fractures waiting for the wrong weight, the wrong vibration. His eyes flicked from the foal to the narrow walls above them. Fine grains of dirt trickled down in places, disturbed by the subtle movement of the earth. He swore under his breath, heart accelerating again. "We can't stay here," he said, the words firm despite the fear pressing in. The horse stamped once, restless now, as if it had sensed the same danger long before he had. It turned its head toward the slope leading out of the cut, the path they had used, the only way back, to open ground. The rancher's mind raced. Carrying the foal again would be risky. The climb was steep, his muscles already taxed. But staying was not an option. He could feel the ground's instability through the soles of his boots now, subtle but unmistakable. He knelt once more, sliding his arms beneath the foal, testing its weight. The foal tensed, then relaxed, slightly, too tired to resist. He took a breath and lifted, slower this time, careful not to rush. The sound came again, louder now, a crack like a dry branch snapping somewhere above them. "Move," he muttered, to himself as much as to the animal in his arms. He started toward the slope, each step deliberate, every sense narrowed to the feel of ground beneath him. Dirt shifted. A small cascade of pebbles skittered past his boot, bouncing down into the cut. His jaw clenched, and he leaned into the incline, refusing to look anywhere but where his foot would land next. Above them, the horse moved first, positioning itself near the top of the slope, body angled in a way that broke the wind and cleared space. It did not rush him. It did not crowd him. It held the place, steady as stone. The rancher climbed, breath burning, legs threatening to give out. Halfway up, the foal shifted in his arms, and his balance wavered. He froze, heart hammering, then adjusted his grip, redistributing the weight until he could move again. Another rumble passed through the earth, closer now, sharper. He pushed harder. When he reached the top, he nearly collapsed, dragging himself and the foal onto firmer ground just as a section of the cut wall sloughed off below them, dirt and rock pouring down into the space they had just vacated. He rolled onto his side, clutching the foal, chest heaving as the sound echoed and then faded into silence. For a long moment, none of them moved. The wind swept across the open ground above the cut, cool and insistent, carrying away the dust and the danger with equal indifference. The rancher lay there staring up at the sky, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the land beneath him, but in the way he understood his place within it. He turned his head and met the horse's gaze again. This time, there was no urgency left in it, only relief. He stayed on the ground longer than he should have, one arm still wrapped around the foal, the other pressed into the dirt, as if anchoring himself to something solid. The sky above him was a hard, washed blue, indifferent and vast. For a moment all he could hear was his own breathing, rough and uneven, and the faint rasp of the foal's lungs as it struggled to settle into a steadier rhythm. He rolled onto his knees and then to his feet, moving carefully, testing his balance the way he always did after a hard fall or a close call. The foal trembled in his arms, lighter than it should have been, its head lolling briefly before it managed to lift it again. He adjusted his grip, cradling it closer, feeling the small, frantic heartbeat through its chest. "You're still here," he murmured, not realizing until the words were out that he might have been saying them to himself as much as to the animal. The horse stood a few yards away, angled between him and the broken cut they had escaped. Its body formed a quiet barrier, broad shoulders squared, head turned slightly as it watched the unstable ground below. Dust drifted up in slow ghosts from where the wall had collapsed, but the land seemed to have settled, for now. The rancher took stock of where they were. The open ground above the cut sloped gently upward toward a line of scrub and scattered rock that offered a little shade. Beyond that lay the basin they had crossed earlier, and farther still, the ridge and the long way back toward the road. It was a punishing distance to carry a weakened foal, especially under the rising sun. He shifted the foal's weight again and felt a sharp protest from his lower back. He clenched his teeth, breathing through it. Pain was familiar. Pain was manageable. What unsettled him was the responsibility pressing down on him now, heavier than the animal in his arms. He lowered the foal carefully onto a patch of firmer ground near the sparse shade and knelt beside it. The foal collapsed onto its side, legs folding awkwardly, but its breathing remained steady enough to keep him from panicking. He brushed dirt from its face with slow, deliberate movements, aware of how easily a sudden gesture could send it into another round of useless struggling. The horse stepped closer, stopping just short of touching the foal. Its nostrils flared as it drew in the foal's scent, and it lowered its head, breathing out softly. The sound was almost imperceptible, but the foal responded to it, shifting slightly, neck stretching as if pulled by an instinct older than fear. The rancher watched the exchange, something tight in his chest, easing just enough to let him think clearly again. "This is what you wanted," he said quietly, eyes on the horse. "Not help for you, for it." The horse did not react to the words. It did not need to. Its presence here, its refusal to leave the road, the way it had led him without panic or force, It all made sense now with a clarity that left no room for argument. This had never been about confrontation. It had been about necessity. He glanced toward the basin, half expecting to see more shapes emerge from the rocks. He knew better, though. Wild herds did not rush in when danger lingered. They waited. They trusted only what had already proven itself. The foal attempted to rise again, pushing weakly against the ground. The rancher placed a steadying hand against its chest, guiding it back down. "Not yet," he said gently. "Give it a minute." He scanned the area for anything that could help: more water, deeper shade, a path that would make the journey easier. The land offered little. It never did. Survival out here depended on timing, restraint, and a willingness to adapt when the plan fell apart. His thoughts drifted uninvited to the fences he'd built over the years. Miles of wire stretched tight across the land, dividing, controlling, protecting. He'd always believed they were necessary. Always believed they marked responsibility. Standing here now, with a wild foal at his feet and its guardian watching him with quiet expectation, that belief wavered. He looked at the horse again. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in its flank, the subtle signs of fatigue it had hidden so well until now. This animal had pushed itself hard, harder than he'd given it credit for, crossing ground, waiting, standing its ground against a truck because there had been no other choice. "You trusted me," he said softly, the realization landing with a weight that made his throat tighten. "You had no reason to." The horse met his gaze, eyes dark and unreadable, and then looked away, attention returning to the foal. The message was clear enough. Trust was not something given lightly, and it was not something that came with ceremony. It was an act of survival. The foal stirred again, managing this time to roll onto its belly. Its legs shook as it tried to tuck them beneath itself, muscles quivering with the effort. The rancher watched closely, ready to intervene, but the horse stepped forward, positioning its body so the foal could lean against its legs. The foal pressed into that familiar solidity and stayed upright. The rancher let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There," he murmured. Time passed in measured increments. The sun climbed higher, the heat intensifying, but the shade held. The foal's breathing slowed. Its movements grew more deliberate, less frantic. It was not recovered, not even close, but it was no longer slipping away. The rancher wiped sweat from his face and stood, stretching stiff muscles with a wince. He knew what had to happen next, even if he didn't yet know how he would manage it. He could not take the foal with him. He could not bring it into his world of roads and fences and controlled spaces without breaking something essential. And yet, leaving it entirely to chance felt wrong now in a way it never had before. He looked at the horse, really looked at it, and felt the tremor of something shifting inside him, an old certainty cracking, making room for a harder, truer understanding. "I'll clear the way," he said at last, the words settling into him as soon as they were spoken. "Not just for today." The horse lifted its head slightly, ears flicking toward him, then returned its attention to the foal. There was no acknowledgement, no sign of agreement, but the rancher knew this was what it had come for. The decision settled into him with a strange calm, as if it had been waiting there long before the horse ever stepped onto the road. He looked across the basin again, not with the eyes of a man measuring profit or loss, but with the steady focus of someone calculating consequence. The path back would not be easy. The ground was rough, the sun climbing, and the foal still weak. Nothing about this would bend to convenience. He crouched and checked the foal once more, pressing 2 fingers gently against its neck, counting the pulse. It was still fast but stronger now. The foal's eyes were open, cloudy with fatigue, yet aware, tracking movement in short, uncertain bursts. When he shifted his weight, it flicked an ear toward him, then leaned again into the horse's legs, trusting the solid warmth there more than anything else. "You're going to have to walk," he said quietly, knowing the animal could not understand the words, only the intent behind them. The horse lifted its head at the sound of his voice, watching him with that same steady attention that had first stopped his truck. The rancher felt the familiar urge to explain himself rise up, an old habit shaped by years of justifying decisions to men who wanted answers. He let it go. Explanation wasn't what was being asked of him now. He stood and moved toward the line of scrub and stone that marked the easiest route back across the basin. With careful steps, he kicked aside loose rocks, flattened unstable patches of earth with the heel of his boot, and tested the ground until he found a narrow corridor firm enough for unsteady legs. Each movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the land itself were watching to see what he would choose to do next. When he returned, the foal was on its feet, trembling but upright, supported on one side by the horse's body. The sight tightened his chest again, not with panic this time, but with a quiet, aching recognition of how close this had come to ending differently. "All right," he said, nodding once. "This way." He did not try to lead the foal. He walked ahead instead, slow and visible, letting his presence become part of the path rather than an obstacle within it. The horse followed, guiding the foal forward in short, careful steps, stopping when the foal faltered, waiting when it needed to rest. The rhythm that formed between them was unspoken and precise, shaped by necessity rather than control. They moved inch by inch across the basin. The sun pressed down harder now, heat radiating from the rocks, but the wind still moved through the low ground, offering brief relief. The rancher wiped sweat from his eyes and kept going, muscles burning, back aching, every part of him aware of the cost this was exacting. Halfway across, the foal stumbled. The rancher reacted without thinking, stepping back quickly, hands out, ready to catch what little weight he could. The foal regained its footing with a weak lurch, sides heaving. The horse shifted instantly, positioning itself so the foal could brace against it again. No panic, no wasted movement, just response. The rancher felt something inside him give way then, not collapse, but release. The tight, rigid framework he'd built his life around loosened enough to let a different understanding take shape. Control, he realized, was not the same as responsibility. He had confused the two for a long time. They reached the edge of the basin at last, where the ground rose gently toward the ridge. The foal slowed, chest working harder now, legs trembling with the effort of climbing. The rancher stepped closer, lending his shoulder, letting the foal lean against him just enough to share the burden. Its body was hot and fragile against his side, alive in a way that demanded care rather than command. Each step up the slope was earned. Dirt slid, small stones rolled away beneath their feet. The rancher leaned forward, weight centered, breath controlled, refusing to rush even as fatigue gnawed at him. When they reached the top, he stopped and turned, scanning the basin one last time. From this vantage, the land looked unchanged, just another stretch of rough country, unmarked and indifferent. Anyone passing by would never know what had happened here. The thought struck him hard. For years he had believed that if something wasn't seen, it didn't matter. He knew better now. They moved on, following the path he had cleared, until the ridge fell away and the basin lay behind them. The foal paused, lifting its head, ears twitching as if sensing something beyond sight. The horse halted beside it, gaze fixed on the open land ahead. The rancher followed that gaze and felt a quiet awe settle over him. In the distance, barely visible against the shimmering horizon, shapes moved, dark and fluid, a line of bodies cresting a far rise. The herd had not abandoned them. It had waited. The horse beside him did not rush forward. It did not call out. It simply stood, ensuring the foal could see what awaited it. The foal let out a faint sound, barely audible, and took a tentative step toward the distant figures. The rancher felt a sharp pang then, unexpected and deep. He had carried the weight. He had taken the risk, and now, inevitably, he would step aside. He straightened slowly, watching as the horse guided the foal forward, one careful step at a time, until the distance between them began to grow. The foal paused once, looking back, not at him, but at the ground it had crossed, the space it had survived. That was enough. The rancher stood alone on the ridge, the wind tugging at his shirt, the sun high and unforgiving above him. His muscles ached. His hands shook with exhaustion. Yet, beneath it all, something steadier had taken root, a sense of having chosen something that would not be undone by the return to routine. He turned back toward where the road lay hidden beyond the hills, already knowing that when he reached it, the land would not look the same to him again. The rancher did not follow them. He stood where he was, boots planted on the ridge, watching the space between himself and the retreating figures stretch wider with every careful step they took. The horse stayed close to the foal, matching its pace, adjusting without urgency, without hesitation. The herd ahead slowed, then slowed again, forming a loose arc that held the space open rather than swallowing it. No one rushed, no one panicked. Everything moved with a patience that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The rancher felt something tighten behind his ribs, not pain exactly, but a pressure that came from knowing when to stop holding on. He shifted his weight and lowered himself onto a flat stone, the heat seeping through the fabric of his jeans. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still trembling faintly from exhaustion. He watched the foal pause once more, legs braced, chest rising and falling as it gathered strength. The horse beside it nudged gently at its shoulder, not urging, just reminding. Then the foal walked on. The herd closed around them gradually, bodies overlapping, blending into a single moving shape against the land. Dust lifted and drifted, softening edges until the figures were no more than dark suggestions against the glare. In time, even those faded, leaving only the wind and the long stretch of ground they had crossed together. The rancher remained seated, staring out at the empty basin. The silence that followed was different from the one he had known before. It did not feel like absence. It felt like completion. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs, and let his head hang for a moment. Sweat ran down his spine. His muscles ached in places he usually ignored. When he closed his eyes, he saw again the foal slipping in the dirt, felt the ground shift beneath his boots, heard the sound of stone giving way. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned him. When he looked up, the horse stood a short distance away. It had not followed the herd. The animal faced him squarely, body relaxed but alert, ears forward, eyes steady. The distance between them was measured, not close enough to invite touch, not far enough to suggest retreat. It was the same distance it had chosen on the road. The rancher straightened slowly and stood, dusting his hands on his thighs. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind passed between them, tugging lightly at the horse's mane, lifting the brim of his hat. He searched the animal's face for something familiar, gratitude perhaps, or acknowledgment, but found neither. What he saw instead was recognition, not of a debt repaid, but of a balance restored. "Go on," he said quietly, the words carrying no command. The horse did not move. A faint smile tugged at the corner of the rancher's mouth, surprising him. "Figures," he murmured. He took a step to the side, angling his body away from the basin, away from the path the herd had taken. The gesture was small but intentional. Space mattered. Direction mattered. The horse watched him, then lowered its head briefly. Not a bow, not submission, just a shift that felt like closure. It turned, muscles flowing beneath its coat, and began to walk away, following the faint line left by the others. It stopped once halfway down the slope. The rancher felt the pause before he saw it. He lifted his head, meeting the horse's gaze one last time. The look held no urgency now, no demand, only a quiet finality, as if both of them understood that what had passed between them did not need repeating. The horse turned and disappeared over the rise. The rancher stood alone again. He stayed there longer than necessary, letting the sun burn against his skin, letting the wind carry the moment away, piece by piece. When he finally turned back toward the road, his legs protested, stiff and tired, but he welcomed the ache. It grounded him in the present. The walk back felt longer than it had any right to. Each step stirred thoughts he had kept buried under routine and responsibility. He saw fences in his mind, not as lines of protection, but as choices made permanent through habit. He wondered how many times he had closed something off simply because it was easier than reconsidering. When the truck came into view, parked where he had left it, it looked smaller somehow. Just a tool, just a means of getting from one place to another. He rested a hand on the hood before climbing in, feeling the heat trapped beneath the metal. He did not start the engine right away. He sat with the door open, staring out at the land that stretched unbroken in every direction. Tomorrow he would still be a rancher. The work would still be there. The fences would still stand. But not all of them. He closed the door gently and turned the key, the engine coming to life with a familiar rumble. As he pulled onto the road, dust rising behind him, he glanced once more toward the ridge where the horse had last stood. The land gave no sign in return. That was all right. Some changes were meant to remain invisible. The road carried him back into his life without ceremony. Tires hummed against packed dirt, dust trailing behind the truck like a familiar shadow. But the rhythm felt altered, as if something subtle had slipped out of alignment. The land looked the same, fences stretching toward the horizon, cattle grazing in slow, patient clusters, sky wide and unbothered, but he no longer moved through it as though it answered only to him. He drove past the first gate without stopping, then slowed near the second, where the fence line bent toward a shallow draw. He had repaired that stretch more times than he could count. Floods loosened posts there, soil shifted, wire sagged. It was a problem spot, one he'd learned to correct quickly, efficiently, without thought. He pulled over and shut off the engine. The sudden quiet settled around him, broken only by the wind threading through the dry grass. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the echo of the day in his bones, the ache in his back, the stiffness in his legs, the weight of an understanding that had followed him all the way here. He stepped out of the truck and walked to the fence. Up close, the wire looked older than he remembered, dulled by sun and time, stretched tight between posts driven deep into stubborn ground. This fence marked the boundary between what he claimed and what he allowed. He had always believed those two things were the same. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around the wire. It vibrated faintly under his touch, humming with tension. He imagined the foal on the other side of the ridge, learning again how to place its feet. He imagined the horse standing watch, not because it wanted power, but because something weaker depended on it. The memory pressed against him, not as guilt, but as clarity. He went back to the truck and retrieved the bolt cutters from behind the seat. The weight of them in his hands felt heavier than it should have. He carried them back to the fence, positioned the jaws around the wire, and paused. No one was watching. No neighbor would see. There would be no immediate consequence, no reward. Tomorrow the cattle might wander farther than planned. The line he'd relied on would be broken. He squeezed the handles. The wire snapped with a sharp metallic crack, recoiling slightly before falling slack. The sound rang out across the quiet field, startling in its finality. He cut another strand, then another, working methodically until a wide gap opened where the fence had once stood firm. He stepped back and studied it. The opening looked small against the vastness of the land, almost insignificant. Yet the space felt charged, like a held breath released. Wind moved through it freely now, carrying seeds, dust, possibility. He leaned the cutters against the post and rested his hands on his hips. For the first time in years, he did not feel the urge to fix what he had just undone. "This doesn't make me careless," he said aloud, testing the thought. The land did not argue. He climbed back into the truck and drove once on, passing the opening without closing it behind him. As the sun dipped lower, the light softened, stretching long shadows across the ground. The day's heat loosened its grip, replaced by a cooler air that settled into his lungs with each breath. When he reached the house, he parked and shut off the engine. The familiar creaks of the old place greeted him, the porch boards, the wind against the siding. Everything waited for him as it always had. Yet he did not go inside right away. He stood at the edge of the yard, looking out toward the land that rolled away beyond the fence line. Somewhere out there, paths crossed and uncrossed without regard for ownership. Somewhere, a foal stood on steadier legs because a boundary had been crossed rather than enforced. He thought of the horse one last time, not as a miracle, not as a symbol, but as what it had been, a living thing that knew when to stand still and when to lead. A creature that had trusted him without yielding itself to him. "I won't forget," he said quietly. Night began to gather at the edges of the field, shadows deepening, stars pricking through the sky one by one. He turned toward the house at last, carrying with him the weight of the day, not as a burden, but as something earned. Tomorrow there would be work. There always was. But some work, he now understood, did not involve building or fixing or tightening what had come loose. Some work required knowing what to leave open, and that, more than anything he had done with his hands, changed the way he walked back into his life. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think you would have done if you were in his place? Would you have followed the horse or driven away? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More true, heartfelt stories like this are waiting for you here.